Welcome all. As you may gather from the title of this video, I'll be talking about the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, which was recently announced, and my world condemnation is merely a reflection of what I've noticed on comments in YouTube, internet forums and so forth about this release. Now, I've got two things that I want to talk about: the cons and the pros. And the cons are those points that people have sort of raised in a negative aspect about the new camera, and some of it reflects old stories and old worries about the gear itself. And I found basically 16 points that people have gone about virtually condemning the camera for what it is, and I'll just go through those in short form. 1 point, only 6K. So what? Do you really need an 8K, 10K, 12K, 18K camera in that particular area that it's supposed to cover? The new Sony FX3 is only 4K. I'm not too sure if people are complaining about that yet, but they probably will. Most other cameras of the same sort of competition area are all 6K as well, so I don't see why they're worried about being a 6K camera. No IBIS. Again, that same old thing. FX3 certainly comes with IBIS, but with IBIS comes other problems, and true cinema cameras generally don't tend to have IBIS because of the issues that you can get with such things as moving about, heat generation and so forth, though obviously some of those things can be sorted out technically, but a lot of cinema operators don't really care for IBIS. I certainly don't want IBIS. I've have a camera with IBIS, and when I use that and pan about and so forth, the IBIS creates more problems than it solves. So I'm not outside doing vlogging where it might be handy, so I don't really care. Another complaint was no constant autofocus, and that again is crap in a lot of situations for vloggers and that. Yeah, CAF is good, but I've seen the results with some cameras when they're doing constant autofocus as the camera goes and picks all sorts of random objects from the scene itself. And there's no CAF when it comes to using cinema lenses, for example. So I don't think that the autofocus issue is as big as it is. It's certainly coming from a lot of people who come from digital SLRs and hybrid cameras, which have good autofocus for stills photography. But for cinema, I don't really think it's an issue the way they make it. Other complaints are that there's no PL mount, the positive lock mount, no RF mount, which is the latest Canon one, or no L mount, which is the Leica Panasonic mount. And I think these are sort of issues that relate to what's available with licensing and so forth. And the EF mount that it comes with really it's a vast array of lenses available for it. There are adapters available for PL mount for the camera, I believe, not RF or L mount. But that's not the target audience that Blackmagic is obviously looking at the moment. They have PL mounts and so forth in their other cameras. This is supposed to be attracting those people who already have, say, Canon lenses or similar, and can adapt them to the camera. And pretty much most of the manual cinema lenses can be adapted, except for obviously some of the PL mount ones, which are quite large and huge. But then who's going to be really using those lenses with a camera of this type? Again, associated with that is no swappable lens mount. All of these things just increase the cost. When you look at the price of the camera, you start putting things like that into it, and you're starting to increase the complexity of the camera construction, design, manufacture, and then ultimately the hip pocket. So I don't think it's intended to cater for that sort of audience that wants to swap lens mounts and so forth. It wants to be relatively straightforward and easy to use. Other complaints: sensor's not big enough. S35 sensor is an industry standard and is excellent for pretty much anything out there today. You can get shallow enough focus or depth of field if you want, with variable depending on the lenses you use. And honestly, a lot of people are going back to a deeper depth of field rather than that razor thin depth of field that stills photographers seems to dream about all the time. It's difficult enough to focus with moving subjects, and to have really thin depth of field or depth of focus is sometimes a recipe for disaster. Other complaints are no 4K at 120 frames per second. I really don't know how often people want 120 frames per second for a cinema camera. Yeah, it can be handy at times. The 75 that I can get with my 4Ks, I use that now and then, but not all the time. 24 frames per second sort of is the general standard, and that works. There's no SDI on the camera. Well, that's again a space issue. The camera has become larger already, and now people want even more added to it, which means it's just going to get bigger and bigger. I don't think the likes of the Sony FX3 has SDI on it. Again, it's a space issue. Other complaints, because it's got a tilting screen, like Tilter bought out the license or the rights to a tilting monitor that some guy in China made, that allows you to adapt the existing 6K and 4K monitors to be tilting. They also added a SSD mount behind it, so they're complaining that it doesn't have an SSD mount behind the tilt screen. So what? Use the slots that you've got, or the USB-C for SSD mounting. I heard that, or read somewhere, that one complained about no manual menu controls. Gobsmacked with that one, given that the on-screen controls are about the best on any camera anywhere. It's easy to use. It's almost like using an iPhone. I don't have an iPhone, but from what people say, it's the easiest menu system to use. And now people want manual controls to scroll through menus and whatever else. It's madness, I reckon. The other complaints are awful body shape. Yet nobody complains about the C70, which has a body shape that is, I think, even more cumbersome and bulky on there. People want physical controls for the audio like the C70 has. I'm not too sure why. You're going to do proper audio with a cinema camera, you use an external recorder, and the audio controls that are available there, usually you set them and you forget them. So again, you want things that just bulk out the camera all the time. I think that's kind of mad. People are complaining that it's still too big for gimbals. They want a box. If you want a box, buy one. I find that this camera fits onto a gimbal, and I'm pretty sure the 6K Pro will fit onto a gimbal just as easily. Not every gimbal, obviously, but there are those that it will fit. And the final one is the complaints that I've seen is, I'm now jumping ship. That old threat to leave and go somewhere else. I'm taking my bat and ball and going home. That's fine. Just do it. Don't complain. Don't tell people. Don't announce it to the world. I don't think Blackmagic gives a rat's ass whether an individual or 2 or 10 suddenly decide to go off and buy something else. Big deal. There'll be others coming in here and quite happy to buy the Pro and get along with their lives. Now, they're the negatives that I've sort of seen about the traps. There's probably more, but it's a pretty big list. And from the pros, I only got 7, so half of that list now is just on what I think are the pros anyway, and what people have been commenting on. So the 5-inch 1500 nit tiltable screen is welcomed by a lot of people. It's certainly good at 1500 nits. It's going to be very bright and usable. I'm not so worried about the tilting, but a lot of people were, so their prayers have been answered, and I think that's good. Built-in ND filters, I think, is one of the big issues that a lot of people have been hankering for quite some time, and obviously that is a good thing. NDs, putting them in the front of the camera, can be a pain in the butt, but having at least 3 NDs in there inside, adjustable from the camera itself, is a pretty good move. It also caused the camera obviously to get bigger, but you've got to pay for that if you want these features in the camera. The move to MPF batteries, I think, is also a good move. There's a battery grip that takes extra batteries, and so you can now actually have 3 batteries operating at the same time, 1 in the camera and 2 in the grip. And I think that's probably necessary. The MPF batteries are a little bit higher capacity. They're certainly cheaper to buy in the market because there's so many variable options available. But I think one thing that people are probably forgetting is that with a 1500 nit screen, if you're running at full 1500 nits, you're going to be chewing through battery power quite a lot. The Blackmagic 12G that I use, 2 MPF batteries on there, it does go through a lot of power when you're running it even at half power. In fact, I've now dropped it down to 500 nits, which is still fairly bright, and I'll only go up to the higher capacity or the higher brightness if the situation dictates, i.e. very, very bright sunlight and so on. So people need to be wary about that as well, that there's going to be some trade-offs between brightness of the screen and then the battery power that's available. I still prefer the option of having a separate monitor, separate power systems for both, to give you more flexibility rather than that. But that's going to suit a lot of people. The grip and so on is going to be handy. It's got 2 mini Xlr ports now, which is for a lot of people a good move. It allows more versatility with audio, and that's always a good thing. And the other thing is coming up with all these cameras is that the Gen 5 colour science is going to be introduced into the older cameras, so that's great. I think that's one of the best things about it. I think that's one of the things about Blackmagic that sets them above all the other camera manufacturers that I know of, is that they're always providing solid updates to not just the equipment, but also to such things as the Resolve NLE. So you're never left in the lurch as far as that goes. So if they can introduce new firmware and so on to their gear, they will do it, rather than just hold off like some camera companies will intentionally cripple some of their cameras so that it doesn't eat into the other camera models that they want to sell. You might notice that I haven't spoken about the EVF yet, and I will, because that's my most interesting point with it. This little EVF here is, I pointed out this before, it's off one of my Olympus cameras. It is very similar in design to what Blackmagic has done. There's a little input there that looks like a mini HDMI, which slots into the camera, and that then is powered by the camera, and the camera transmits the image to the EVF, which allows you to angle it. This goes to 90 degrees. I think the Blackmagic one will go to about 70. This is from memory, a 2.4 megapixel imager, and it might be less in fact, but there's also, I think, a 4 megapixel one that came out. These have now been discontinued because they changed the camera styles. But what I'm hoping for is that with the EVF that Blackmagic has introduced, that they've thought about making an adapter to which you can attach that EVF and then use that with any Blackmagic camera, or any camera for that matter, by plugging into a HDMI output. So like in both of the monitors that I have, I've got a HDMI out, so I can actually connect another monitor or anything into it. It'd be nice to be able to have an adapter that you can plug a cable into the adapter and then plug it into the monitor and get HDMI into an external EVF like that. So it'd be really nice if you could just put an EVF onto that for hand holding or whatever, and being able to do focus and composition in really bright conditions, which means you don't have to have your monitor at as high a brightness all the time. But I don't know if they've done that. There obviously needs to be a fair bit of electronics in the camera supporting the EVF, and that's why the EVF for the new Pro is actually so small. When you have a look at all the other EVFs that are around, they're all about the size of a beer can. And the reason for that is because they've got they're basically a monitor put into an EVF housing. So in this case, like with the Olympus, there are going to be electronics in the camera that support the EVF, but by the same token, I think you could possibly make an adapter that contains those electronics the way that a monitor will have in there, and allow you to then to adapt the EVF in any way you want. It'd be great if you could, say, put a cable into it, go into an adapter, and then the cable goes from the adapter into your monitor, for example, or your camera, and you could use a magic arm or whatever to hold that adapter in place, so that you could put that anywhere and use it any way you want. I'm hoping that Blackmagic maybe hear about it and think it might be a worthwhile thing to do. But it'd be great, because then you'd suddenly have a really small EVF that you can use for focus and composition for those times that the monitor's not enough. And it's not intended to be a permanent all-day EVF. Clearly it's not going to be useful for that, because it's much, much smaller than the main ones used in cinema cameras. But I think it would still work really, really well, and I think a lot of people would be jumping at it if they could get it, because it's not badly priced for what it is itself, and if an adapter could be made at a reasonable price, you'd have something that you could use on any camera and virtually any camera anyway, and have a really good, valuable EVF at hand. I think they'd sell like hotcakes if Blackmagic could make that. But that's all I wanted to say. It doesn't matter what people are given, they're always going to complain. It's like that old adage goes that if someone's shoving diamonds up your ass, there'll be people complaining that the diamonds aren't big enough. And that's a fact of life. So I think Blackmagic has done a great thing with their camera, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else they'll bring down the track. A little box micro camera update would be great. Really good, sort of like a crash cam type situation with a micro 4/3 sensor, 4K, with all the sort of B-raw capabilities that the cameras currently have. I think would be a welcome addition. It doesn't need to be 6K, 8K or anything like that, but just an update of what they already have. So here's hoping, and that's all I've got to say for today. And on that note, I'll say cheers.